The bus rolled into Ravens Fair just as the fog began to settle like a heavy shroud across the crumbling streets. Emily Carter pressed her forehead to the cold glass, staring out at the town that time had forgotten. It had been more than 20 years since she last set foot here. She was a child then, brought only for her grandmother's funeral, and even at that age she had felt something unnatural in the air, as though the town itself held its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to happen. Now, as an investigative journalist, Emily told herself she had come back for a story. The town had recently made headlines again, a rash of mysterious deaths, bodies left grotesquely mutilated, tongues torn out, mouths frozen in silent screams. The local authorities dismissed it as hysteria, coincidence, or brutal accidents, but Emily knew better. She had read between the lines, sifted through the whispers buried in old newspaper clippings. Each article carried the same shadow, the same name that had been buried for decades, Mary Shaw. The bus hissed to a stop in front of the old Ravens Fair depot. The driver didn't bother with a word of farewell, only nodded stiffly and avoided her eyes. Emily stepped down into the chilled night air, clutching her bag. The town smelled of damp wood, rust, and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. Most of the shops were shuttered, their windows darkened with dust. A single flickering streetlight buzzed overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch far too long across the cracked pavement. Her motel was only 2 blocks away, but the walk felt like a journey through a graveyard. She passed faded posters peeling from walls, decades-old circus announcements, puppet shows, and vaudeville acts. One poster stopped her dead in her tracks. Its edges were torn, the ink washed pale with rain, but the face on it remained intact. A woman's stern features, thin lips, hollow eyes. Below, in bold letters. Mary Shaw, the woman who never had children, only dolls. Emily's stomach tightened. The stories her mother used to whisper in hushed tones came back with razor clarity. Mary Shaw, the ventriloquist who lost her voice in death, but gained it again in the afterlife. A woman lynched by the townsfolk after children vanished, tongues cut out, bodies posed like lifeless marionettes. They buried her with her collection of dolls, or so the story went. But legends had a way of clawing back to the surface, especially in Ravens Fair. She tore her eyes away and hurried on. The motel was worse than she remembered, walls stained yellow, the air thick with mildew. The man at the desk barely looked at her when she checked in, sliding the key across the counter without a word. His silence clung to her like cobwebs. As she climbed the narrow stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that every sound she made was being listened to, recorded by something unseen. Inside her room, she set her bag down and pulled out the recorder she always carried. Her plan was to gather her notes, track down surviving townsfolk, and uncover the truth. Yet a darker reason gnawed at her for coming back. It wasn't just the story. Emily's grandmother had been born in Ravens Fair, and her mother never spoke of her childhood here. The family tree was riddled with gaps, missing names, vanished relatives. She felt the pull of blood, a need to confront what her family had buried. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered the motel room. The wallpaper peeled in strips, like old skin. The radiator clanked and hissed. Then she heard it, a faint tapping. At first, she thought it was the pipes, but no, it was too deliberate. Tap. 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 It came from the wardrobe in the corner. Emily froze, heart slamming against her ribs. Slowly, she reached for the handle, her breath hitching. She pulled the door open with a trembling hand. Inside, only her hanging coat swayed slightly as if disturbed. No one there. Nothing there. But at the bottom of the wardrobe, sitting neatly upright, was a doll she had never seen before. Its porcelain face was cracked, eyes painted too wide, lips frozen in a grin that felt mocking. And in the dim yellow light, she swore its head tilted ever so slightly toward her. Emily staggered back, her throat dry. "What the hell?" she whispered. She didn't touch it. She couldn't. She shoved the wardrobe shut and backed away, fumbling for her recorder. Her hands shook as she pressed the button. "This is Emily Carter," she whispered into the device. "Day 1 in Raven's Fair. I think the stories about Mary Shaw might be true. There's something here. I found a doll." Her voice cracked. She stopped recording. And then, from the wardrobe, came a sound that froze her blood. A voice. Thin, raspy, childlike. "Hello, Emily." Her scream never left her throat. Emily barely slept after the whisper in the wardrobe. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the doll's porcelain grin stretching wider, its glassy eyes rolling to follow her in the dark. By dawn, her nerves were frayed, her mind buzzing with exhaustion and dread. She forced herself to leave the motel. Staying inside that room felt like suffocating inside a coffin. With her recorder and notebook tucked into her bag, Emily walked through the silent streets of Raven's Fair. The fog clung low to the ground, curling around her ankles like ghostly fingers. The town was nearly deserted. A few hollow-eyed locals drifted along the sidewalks, their heads lowered as if terrified of being seen. When Emily tried to ask questions, about the deaths, about Mary Shaw, most turned away, muttering that some things were better left alone. But one man stopped her. An old shopkeeper with shaking hands leaned across the counter of a dusty hardware store. His face was pale, his lips chapped, but his eyes gleamed with something close to panic. "You're Carter's girl, aren't you?" he rasped. Emily froze. "You knew my mother?" He nodded quickly, scanning the empty street outside. "Everyone knew your family. Your bloodline, it's tied to her." Her skin prickled. "Tied to who?" The shopkeeper's jaw tightened. He didn't say the name. Instead, he whispered, "Leave while you still can. She doesn't forgive. She doesn't forget. She only waits." Emily pressed him, but he only shook his head, eyes filling with fear. Finally, he shoved something into her hand, an old cassette tape in a cracked case, the label faded and smudged. She turned it over, reading the faint words. "Mary Shaw, Final Seance, 1940. Emily felt her stomach drop. "Where did you get this?" she demanded. But the man wouldn't answer. He only backed away, muttering prayers under his breath, until he vanished into the fog. Back in her motel room, Emily set the cassette into her old tape recorder. The machine clicked, whirred, and then filled the room with static. She adjusted the volume, her breath quickening. And then she heard it. A woman's voice. Low, cold, deliberate. "This is Mary Shaw. They think they can silence me. They think they can bury me. But I will live on, in their blood, in their children's children." The hairs on Emily's arms rose. The tape crackled, followed by faint weeping in the background, too real to be a performance. A child sobs. Then Shaw's voice again, chanting words Emily couldn't understand. The weeping stopped abruptly. And something else answered. A whisper, but layered, inhuman, like many mouths speaking as one, "We will wait. We will come." The tape cut to static. Emily's throat went dry. She stopped the recorder and sat in stunned silence. Her reflection in the motel mirror looked pale, her wide eyes filled with fear. She wasn't imagining this. The curse wasn't just folklore. And then. A knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. Emily jumped, her chest tightening. She crept toward the door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. No answer. She unlocked the chain, turned the knob, and slowly opened the door. No one there. Only the empty, fog-choked hallway. But when she looked down, her heart nearly stopped. Sitting just outside her door was the same porcelain doll from the wardrobe, its cracked face smiling up at her, its hands folded neatly in its lap. Emily's breath hitched. She slammed the door shut and stumbled backward, her body shaking. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run, to get out of Raven's Fair before it was too late. But she couldn't, not now. Not when she had proof. Not when her own blood was somehow tied to this nightmare. She grabbed her recorder again, pressing the button with shaking fingers. "This is Emily Carter. I have evidence of Mary Shaw's séance, her final words before she died. She promised vengeance, tied to the families of this town. And now." Her voice cracked. "Now she's here." Suddenly, the recorder cut out. The machine whined and screeched, the tape reel spinning on its own. Emily yanked it away from her mouth, staring in horror. And then, from the machine itself, came a voice that wasn't hers. "Hello again, Emily." The voice was wet, guttural, but unmistakable. "Mary Shaw." The lights in the room flickered violently. The wardrobe door creaked open. Inside, lined neatly from top to bottom, sat dolls, dozens of them, porcelain faces pale and cracked, painted eyes wide, mouths frozen mid-laugh. Their tiny heads turned in unison toward her. Emily dropped the recorder. Every instinct told her to scream. But she remembered the legend her mother had once whispered when she was a child. "If you scream in Mary Shaw's presence, she takes your tongue." So Emily swallowed her terror, choking down the scream clawing its way up her throat. Her entire body trembled, her lips pressed shut as tears burned her eyes. And then, one of the dolls tilted its head and whispered, in a child's voice. "Don't scream, Emily. She's listening." Emily didn't sleep. She couldn't. She sat frozen in her bed until daylight crept weakly through the curtains, the dolls and the wardrobe burned into her mind. When she finally dared to open the doors again, the wardrobe was empty. No dolls. No porcelain faces. No whispering. Just a few hangers swaying gently as though something unseen had brushed past them. She wanted to convince herself it was exhaustion, hallucination. But deep down, she knew the truth. Mary Shaw was back. And she was coming for her. By late morning, the motel felt unbearable. Emily decided she needed answers, real ones, not just ghost stories and rumors. She headed to Raven's Fair's town archives, a squat, brick building that looked as though no one had entered it in years. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and rotting paper. Rows of records stretched endlessly, their drawers heavy with decades of secrets. An elderly woman sat at the front desk. Her skin sagged like melted wax, her milky eyes barely lifting when Emily asked for records on the Carter family. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then, with a shiver, the old woman pushed a stack of files toward her. "Your family," she whispered, her voice thin and trembling. "You were warned not to return." Emily carried the files to a corner table, her hands sweating as she flipped them open. The documents were brittle, ink faded. She read through birth certificates, obituaries, and old police reports. And then she found it. A headline dated 1941. "Local family murdered by unknown assailant, tongues removed." Below the headline was a photograph. A family of 4, their faces blurred by time. Her eyes caught on the name beneath it, Margaret Carter. Her great-grandmother. Emily's pulse spiked. She skimmed the article, her breath quickening with each word. The Carters had been one of several families slaughtered after Shaw's death. The killings were never solved. Witnesses swore they saw dolls moving in the shadows, heard children crying where no children lived. And in bold at the end of the article, "Survivor, infant Emily Carter, found unharmed in her crib." Emily's vision blurred. She dropped the paper as her hands shook violently. Infant Emily Carter. She wasn't just a journalist digging into someone else's curse. She was born into it. The realization weighed on her as she stumbled outside, gasping for air. The fog seemed thicker now, clinging to her skin like icy fingers. She wanted to run, to flee Raven's Fair forever, but where would she go? How do you outrun blood? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. The screen showed an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. Static. Then a voice, sharp and whispery. Don't scream, Emily. She's almost here. The line went dead. Emily stood trembling in the street. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something strange. Across the road, an abandoned house leaned against its own decay. The windows were shattered, the door barely hanging on. And in one of the upstairs windows, she swore she saw a face. Pale. Hollow-eyed. Watching her. When she blinked, it was gone. But she couldn't ignore the pull. Something was drawing her inside. The house was dark, the floorboards groaning under her weight. Dust coated every surface. In the living room, she found something that made her chest tighten. Rows of dolls lined the mantelpiece, all different, all broken in some way, cracked faces, missing eyes, limbs hanging by threads. She lifted her recorder with trembling hands. This is Emily Carter. I found another house tied to Shaw's legend. Dolls, dozens of them. I think this is where she kept some of her collection. The air turned colder. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She spun around, heart hammering. Nothing there. And then, a doll fell from the mantel and hit the floor with a sickening crack. Its porcelain face shattered, shards scattering across the boards. Emily's breath caught in her throat. From the shards, a voice hissed. You can't break us, Emily. The other dolls turned their heads toward her. One by one. The sound of wood splintering filled the house, as if unseen hands were prying it apart. The air buzzed with whispers, all chanting the same name, Shaw. 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 Emily backed toward the door, her chest tight, her breath shallow. She tried not to scream, biting her tongue until she tasted blood. But then she saw it, carved into the wall above the fireplace, in jagged letters. She had no children. Only dolls. But you. You are her legacy. Emily stumbled out of the house, clutching her recorder like a lifeline. She didn't know how far she ran, only that she couldn't stop hearing the whispers. Couldn't stop feeling the eyes on her back. Mary Shaw wasn't just haunting Raven's Fair. She was haunting Emily. The church bells rang in Raven's Fair that night, though no one had rung them in years. Their hollow clang rolled across the fog-drenched town like a death knell. Emily jolted awake in her motel bed, her heart racing. For a moment, she thought it was part of a dream. But then the screaming started. She grabbed her recorder and ran outside. Down the street, a crowd had gathered in front of a narrow townhouse. The air smelled of rust and rot, metallic and sharp. People stood in silence, their faces pale, their eyes wide with horror. Emily pushed her way to the front, her breath catching in her throat at the sight before her. The front door was wide open. And inside, slumped in the hallway, was a man's body. His mouth was stretched impossibly wide, skin torn at the corners. His tongue was gone. His eyes bulged, frozen in terror. His body was twisted like a discarded puppet, limbs bent at wrong angles, head tilted as if controlled by invisible strings. The locals whispered the name no one dared speak loudly. Shaw. Emily raised her recorder, her hand trembling. Another death. Victim's tongue removed. Limbs contorted, like a doll. Her voice cracked. It's her. It has to be her. A heavy hand grabbed her shoulder. She spun around and met the gaze of a tall, broad-shouldered man with piercing blue eyes. He looked older than her by at least a decade, his beard flecked with gray. You shouldn't be here, he said sharply. Emily pulled free. I'm not leaving. I'm documenting this. Who are you? Name's Daniel Reeves, he said, lowering his voice. Paranormal investigator. Been tracking cases like this for years. And if you've seen what I think you've seen, he studied her face, his expression grim. Then you're already part of it. Emily's chest tightened. Part of what? The curse, Daniel said flatly. Mary Shaw's curse. If you're Carter blood, you can't escape it. She'll come for you. She always does. Emily's knees nearly buckled. He knew. He knew about her family. How do we stop her? She asked. Daniel's gaze darkened. You don't stop her. You survive her. And if you want any chance of surviving, you burn everything she ever touched, every doll, every artifact. If even one survives, so does she. Before Emily could respond, another scream split the night. The crowd turned as a young woman burst from a nearby alley, her hands clawing at her mouth. Blood spilled between her fingers. She collapsed to her knees, convulsing violently. When Emily and Daniel reached her, it was already too late. Her jaw hung open, tongue gone. Her body stiffened, then slumped to the cobblestones. The silence that followed was suffocating. And then Emily heard it. A child's laughter. High-pitched. Hollow. Drifting from the shadows of the alley. She whipped her head toward the sound, her heart hammering. There, sitting against the wall in the faint glow of the streetlight, was a doll. Not porcelain this time. Wood. Its painted grin stretched ear to ear, its head tilted unnaturally. Emily's stomach churned. She turned to Daniel. We have to destroy it. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pulled a flask of lighter fluid from his coat, doused the doll, and struck a match. The flames hissed and roared, consuming the wood. For a moment, Emily thought it was over. But then the doll screamed. Not wood burning. Not crackling fire. A scream. A child's, high and shrill, echoing off the buildings until Emily's ears rang. The flames died out almost instantly, leaving nothing but a pile of ash. The townsfolk scattered, whispering frantic prayers. Daniel looked at Emily. That was just one. There are more. Hundreds more. Maybe thousands. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. Then we burn them all. Daniel shook his head. You don't understand. They're hidden. Buried in the walls of houses. Locked in attics. Buried in graves. Some families don't even know they're keeping them. And every single one ties her to this world. Emily's hands shook. Then where do we start? Daniel stared into the fog, his jaw tight. We start where it ended, her grave. But first, he turned back to Emily, his voice low. You need to know something. She's not just after the town anymore. She's after you. Emily's stomach dropped. Why me? Because you're her bloodline, Daniel said grimly. And she won't rest until she makes you one of her dolls. As if on cue, the church bells rang again. But this time, they weren't distant. They were inside Emily's head. And in the ringing, she heard a voice. Don't scream, Emily. I'm coming. The cemetery sat on the edge of Raven's Fair like a festering wound. The iron gates groaned when Daniel shoved them open, their hinges screeching as though warning them not to enter. Emily clutched her recorder tightly, her breath puffing out in the cold night air. Every tree leaned skeletal over the crooked tombstones, their branches twisted like grasping fingers. They walked in silence, their flashlights cutting narrow paths through the fog. Emily could feel the earth beneath her shoes sink slightly with each step, as though the dead below shifted restlessly at their approach. She was buried here. Emily whispered. Daniel nodded. They laid her in a coffin, sealed her mouth shut with thread, buried her with her dolls. They thought that would silence her. He glanced at Emily, his eyes hard. They were wrong. After several minutes of weaving through toppled gravestones, they found it. A massive stone slab, cracked down the middle, the name carved into its surface nearly worn away by time. Mary Shaw. Emily's stomach twisted. Just seeing the name made her feel sick, as though something inside her blood recoiled. Daniel crouched, brushing moss from the stone. "Look at this," he muttered. The ground before the grave was disturbed, fresh dirt scattered, the earth uneven. Emily's chest tightened. "She's not here." Daniel nodded grimly. "Someone dug her up." Emily shined her flashlight into the broken soil. Her beam caught something pale sticking out of the dirt. For a heartbeat, she thought it was bone. But as she leaned closer, she realized it was porcelain. A doll's arm, reaching upward through the soil as if trying to claw free. Her skin crawled. She stumbled back. "There are dolls down there." Daniel's face hardened. "Of course there are." He pulled a crowbar from his bag and jammed it beneath the cracked slab. "Help me." Together, they pried the stone loose. It fell to the side with a deafening thud. What lay beneath was worse than Emily could have imagined. The coffin was split wide open, wood rotted and torn. Inside was not just one body but dozens of dolls, crammed in with bones that looked far too human. Their glass eyes glinted in the flashlight beams, their jaws sewn shut with thick black thread. Some were missing limbs. Others had faces carved with grotesque smiles. And the coffin was empty of Mary Shaw. Emily gagged, clamping a hand over her mouth. "Where's her body?" she whispered. Daniel scanned the grave, his voice grim. "She's not in one place. She's in all of them. Every doll, every artifact, every piece is part of her." As if in response, the dolls inside the coffin twitched. Emily's breath hitched. She stumbled backward as porcelain fingers scraped against the coffin walls. Dozens of tiny heads turned toward her in unison, their painted eyes glistening in the dark. Then, in one sickening motion, the dolls sat up. Emily swallowed a scream, her throat burning. She remembered the rule. If she screamed, she'd lose her tongue. She bit down so hard she tasted iron. The dolls began to crawl out of the coffin, their limbs jerking unnaturally, joints cracking as they scuttled across the dirt like insects. Their mouths tore open, stitches snapping, unleashing a chorus of whispers. "Emily! Emily! Don't scream!" Daniel cursed, fumbling with his lighter fluid. He doused the nearest cluster of dolls and struck a match. The fire roared, illuminating their grinning faces as they writhed and shrieked in high-pitched wails. The sound pierced Emily's ears, drilling into her skull until she thought her head would split open. But the fire only seemed to enrage them. Dolls clawed their way up Daniel's legs, porcelain teeth snapping, glass eyes glinting. He tore them off, smashing them against the ground, but for each one broken, two more crawled from the grave. Emily's flashlight beam caught movement inside the coffin. For a split second, she saw something not dull, not human. A pale, withered hand stretching out from the shadows. Long, needle-thin fingers. The hand withdrew before she could fully see. But she knew. Mary Shaw was not gone. She was awake. "Run!" Daniel shouted, stomping another doll into shards. "We can't take them all." Emily hesitated, her recorder still clutched in her hand. A voice hissed inside her mind, slithering like smoke. "Stay, Emily. Don't leave me. You're mine." She bit down harder, nearly drawing blood, and forced herself to turn and run. Daniel followed, torching dolls as he went. Their tiny screams echoed through the cemetery until the night seemed alive with their shrieking. When they finally burst through the iron gates, Emily collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. Her hands shook violently, and her recorder slipped to the ground. From the trees behind them came a single sound. A woman's voice. Smooth. Cold. Mocking. "Don't scream, Emily." Emily's blood froze. Because the voice didn't come from behind them. It came from inside her head. Raven's Fair was no longer quiet. By the next evening, the town had become a stage for horror. Emily and Daniel moved through the streets as shadows darted in windows and voices echoed where no one stood. The townsfolk, once cold but human, now seemed wrong. Their eyes were hollow, their movements stiff, as if pulled by invisible strings. Emily noticed it first in the woman sweeping her porch. Each brush of the broom was the same, mechanical, her head jerking unnaturally with every motion. Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's starting." "What's starting?" Emily whispered. "She's not content with dolls anymore," he said grimly. "She's using people." As if on cue, the woman's head snapped toward them. Her mouth opened far too wide, splitting at the corners. No sound came out, just a wet gurgle. Then, with sudden violence, she dropped the broom and lunged. Emily screamed before she could stop herself. Daniel shoved her back against the wall, clamping his hand over her mouth. "Don't," he hissed. Emily's throat burned with the cry she barely choked down. She tasted blood where she'd bitten her tongue. Across the street, the woman stood frozen, her jaw hanging open, eyes blank. She swayed for a moment, then collapsed in a heap on her porch like a marionette with its strings cut. Emily's entire body trembled. She's turning them into dolls." Daniel nodded grimly. One by one. They fled to the library, one of the few places still unlocked. Inside, the smell of mold and dust mixed with something coppery, like old blood. Books lay scattered across the floor, pages torn as though someone had rifled through them in desperation. Daniel pulled an old ledger from the shelves, flipping through pages with frantic urgency. "There has to be something, some clue we missed." Emily, still shaken, sat across from him, her recorder in hand. "What if there isn't? What if this can't be stopped?" Daniel slammed the book shut. "Everything has a weakness. Even her." He leaned closer, his voice low. "But it's not just the dolls. It's blood. She bound herself to Raven's Fair through family lines, through yours." Emily's breath hitched. "You mean I'm the reason she's still here?" Daniel didn't answer. His silence was enough. A sudden creak broke the quiet. Emily turned. Between the stacks, a figure stood. At first, she thought it was another townsfolk, but then the figure stepped into the light, and she realized with a sickening drop in her stomach that it wasn't alive. It was one of Shaw's dolls, but larger than the rest, taller than a child, its porcelain face cracked, its grin impossibly wide. Its head tilted, jerking to the side. Then it spoke in a hollow, childlike voice. "Emily. Time to play." The shelves trembled as books tumbled to the ground. More figures emerged between the stacks, men, women, children. But their movements were wrong, stiff, marionette-like. Their mouths hung open, eyes glassy, bodies jerking with invisible tugs. The townsfolk turned into puppets. Daniel cursed and pulled Emily behind him. "We need to move. Now." The puppets advanced, their jaws clacking open and shut, the sound echoing like snapping bones. One lunged forward, arms reaching. Daniel swung a crowbar with brutal force, cracking the puppet's skull wide open. But instead of collapsing, it shrieked, an inhuman, high-pitched wail that made Emily's ears bleed. The others responded to the scream, rushing forward. Emily and Daniel bolted through the library doors, crashing into the foggy night. Behind them, the shrieking continued, echoing through the streets like the chorus of a broken choir. They didn't stop running until they reached the old theater at the center of town. Its marquee was shattered, its windows black. Emily collapsed on the steps, her chest heaving. "She's turning everyone into her puppets," she gasped. "There's no one left." Daniel crouched beside her, his face grim. "That's what she wants. A stage. A whole town of dolls to perform for her." Emily shook her head violently. "We can't let her. There has to be a way to end this." Daniel's gaze hardened. "There is one way. But it's not one you'll want to hear." Emily swallowed. "Tell me." He leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "If she bound herself to your bloodline, the only way to break the curse is to cut it off." Emily's eyes widened. "You mean kill me?" Daniel didn't answer. But he didn't have to. The silence that followed was more suffocating than any scream. And then, from the shattered windows of the theater, a woman's laughter floated out, cold, sharp, echoing like broken glass. Mary Shaw's voice. "Don't scream, Emily. The show is about to begin." The theater loomed like a tomb. Its broken doors gaped open, and the laughter inside beckoned. Emily's body shook as if her bones themselves knew what awaited. Daniel steadied her arm, though his grip trembled too. "Once we go in," he whispered, "there's no turning back." Emily swallowed hard. "Then let's end it." They stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was suffocating, thick with the stench of rot and damp wood. The stage curtain swayed though no breeze stirred. The faint light of 1,000 candle flames flickered across the theater. And there they were. The townsfolk. Row after row of them filled the audience, sitting upright in their seats. But they weren't alive anymore. Their skin was gray, their mouths carved into twisted grins, their eyes wide and unblinking. Strings of shadow coiled from the ceiling, tethering each of them like puppets. Their jaws clicked open and shut in unison, a hideous rhythm that echoed through the theater. On the stage stood Billy, the puppet, larger than Emily had ever seen. His porcelain face was cracked, his jaw trembling as though alive. And above him, Mary Shaw. Her form hovered like a marionette suspended in the void. Her face was pale, stretched impossibly thin, her mouth slit from ear to ear. Her black dress trailed into nothingness. She moved in jerks, each motion snapping like pulled strings. Her voice rang out, cold and shrill. "Welcome, Emily, descendant of the bloodline that betrayed me. Tonight, the show ends with you." Emily's knees weakened. She wanted to scream, to cry, but Daniel grabbed her hand hard enough to hurt. "Don't let her hear fear. It's how she feeds." Mary's head snapped to him, her eyes gleaming like shards of glass. "Ah," another voice to silence. The audience, hundreds of dead puppets, laughed in unison, a sound like breaking wood and tearing flesh. Daniel raised the crowbar. "We destroy the artifacts. That's the only way." He charged toward the stage, swinging at the puppet Billy. The blow cracked the porcelain, splintering its face. Instantly, the theater erupted with shrieks. The puppets in the audience thrashed violently, strings tangling, jaws clattering like machine gun fire. Emily rushed to the side of the stage, smashing glass display cases that held smaller dolls, each one splintering like brittle bones. With every artifact destroyed, Mary's form flickered, her voice warping with rage. "Stop," she howled, her voice shaking the walls. "Silence them." The puppets rose from their seats, staggering forward like an army of marionettes. Their heads jerked, their mouths unhinging. One lunged at Emily, teeth snapping. She ducked, driving a shard of glass straight into its throat. It collapsed, but instead of blood, sawdust spilled out. "Emily!" Daniel shouted. She turned just as Mary descended, her skeletal hands reaching, her face splitting into an inhuman maw. Daniel swung at her, but she caught him with a single string of shadow, yanking him into the air like a doll. He screamed, his voice cut off mid-breath as his jaw was pulled open unnaturally wide. Emily's blood froze. "Do you see, Emily?" Mary whispered, her face inches from Daniel's twisted form. "Every scream feeds me. Every silence binds me. And you are my masterpiece." Emily's mind raced. The ledger. The séance recording. The curse was tied to blood, her blood. Mary could never be silenced unless the bloodline ended. Her hands trembled as she lifted the shard of glass. Daniel's eyes met hers, full of agony but also desperate understanding. He couldn't speak, but the look said enough. "Do it." Emily's throat closed with grief. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And before she could lose her nerve, she drove the shard deep into her chest. The theater erupted. Emily's scream never came. Blood filled her throat, but she forced her mouth closed, refusing Mary the sound she craved. Her silence was defiance. Mary shrieked, her form unraveling, strings snapping in the void. The puppets convulsed violently, collapsing in heaps of lifeless flesh and sawdust. Billy's head shattered, his face crumbling into dust. The stage split open as shadows screamed, swirling like a storm. Mary's voice, shrill and desperate, filled the theater. "No. You will not silence me. You cannot end my show." Emily collapsed, her vision fading. Her last sight was Mary's form, breaking apart piece by piece, shrieking into nothingness. Then, silence. When the dust settled, the theater was empty. The puppets were gone. The strings were severed. The candles burned out one by one. Daniel knelt beside Emily, tears streaming down his face. She lay still, her eyes glassy, but her lips curled faintly into something between a smile and relief. For the first time in decades, Raven's Fair was silent. But in the darkness of the shattered stage, a faint sound stirred. A child's giggle. Then the soft clap of porcelain hands. Billy's broken face smiled from the rubble. The silence had only begun.